This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. Here's your host, Paul Shoemaker.
It's really a pleasure for me to be here today with a gentleman I've known for about 20 years, Richard Wu. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Richard in a minute. Richard, it's great to have you here today. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
It's nice to see you, especially as we're working our way through the end of 2020 and looking forward to 2021.
Amen. Let's get to 2021. So let me ask you the first question I ask everybody, which is, when you look at the future, when you look at the decade ahead, what's the personal leadership attribute that you think we're going to need to show up in the world the most? What sticks out for you?
Well, I think what's been proven to be the case now and is going to be absolutely critical going forward is flexibility. And I think the style of that leadership, fluid flexibility, the ability to follow the gravity of where your stakeholders, your partners, or the circumstances are calling you to serve and how best to serve. And for me, flexibility doesn't mean that you're acting without principles or commitment, but it's rather having a longer term vision and goal that you're aiming towards and being able to launch and react and adapt as you move forward towards that goal and not being stuck and keeping that larger goal in front of you. And certainly the events of 2020 have shown us just how unpredictable and uncontrollable life is beyond our reach. And all we really have some command over is ourselves. And I would say that even at times we have to surrender that.
It is a complex world we live in, indeed. Say just a little bit more, if you would, about the notion of how you're flexible and yet you also still have a sort of a compass, a guiding direction. How do you balance those two as a leader?
Well, as we'll talk later in this conversation, I've centered a lot of my leadership approach on really understanding who I am and seeing that as the stepping stone to being able to work with others so that they can actually realize who they are themselves, because the work that needs to get done is never done by one single person, one single organization. And in fact, if you start with concentric circles with you in the beginning, that's not to say that the paradigm is all about being self-centered and that the world revolves around you, but it's understanding that for me to be effective with other people, I have to be authentic and have integrity with what I'm asking them to do, which means I have to ask myself, what do I believe in? What am I willing to risk? What am I willing to admit about what worked and what didn't work? And by doing that, hopefully being able to set the table for others to step into that space. And I think a lot of this is about a phrase that we used when I was working many years ago at Levi Strauss & Company. The idea of move and modify is that too often I think it's very simple to sit in our offices behind Zoom or distant from whatever the issue is we're trying to address and be strategic and very ethereal about what we're trying to get done in the world.
Right.
When in reality, not much happens on the other side of the Zoom channel. It's really only in the world that happens. And it happens with real people. And therefore, a lot of the planning really has to be a framework to get you moving and to actually test what your thinking is and to invite other people into that thinking. And that means you have to then hold your ideas lightly and, in fact, welcome ideas wholeheartedly so that they, in fact, displace what you thought was the world and actually is responding more to the world that is out there in real time.
You can already hear Richard Wu's authenticity in just the first few minutes of our conversation. I want to suggest as a listener, you keep an eye out for three things today. First one, how he has such a North Star that guides him and grounds his authenticity. He even has it at the level of a personal mission statement. He's a person that believes that leadership starts with self, but it's not a self-centered activity. Secondly, we have a little conversation about some of his leadership role models. They didn't come from a corporate hierarchy or a workshop or a seminar or a professional training program. His mentors came from very unexpected places, which is true of a lot of rebuilders. And then third, Richard introduces the idea of organizationless leaders, which I think is a really powerful concept, especially in the decade ahead. And it's interesting also to hear how his thinking on organizationless changed and evolved just from the pandemic, as well as from his own retirement in 2021. Let's get back to the conversation with Richard, and we'll start from where he did leave in 2020 and some of his reflections.
And so when I retired in January of 2020, of course, none of us had any idea that what was about to take place with the pandemic and the fight for racial justice and the economic meltdown, et cetera. But I started the year by participating in a several-day reflective practice retreat where we were actually in each other's company in the before times and we could be together. And part of those several days encompassed the bridge day of New Year's Day 2020. And on New Year's Day, I actually came up with my personal mission statement. And that mission statement has served to be a North Star for me in a lot of ways I didn't fully realize at the time when it came into my being. And so the mission statement, which I keep pasted right below my computer here, is, quote, "I build whole, affirming, and just community through deep listening, reflecting, and storytelling."
Yep, that's very powerful.
And so I share that because when I think of what my role in the world is, it may start with me because I use the phrase "I build," but everything after that is really about service. And it's about justice, it's about wholeness, and affirming. Affirming what and affirming who? It's really through the act of listening and reflecting and storytelling that I think we get the kinds of results that are called for in our world.
Absolutely. So for folks listening, Richard has a high degree of capacity for complexity. He is a unique individual. Just a little bit about Richard, and then we'll continue our conversation. He had a 30-year career in philanthropy and community development. He was in the 90s. He was at Levi Strauss, the company. He was the researcher and designer of a thing called Project Change, which was a 10-year anti-racism program undertaken by the Levi Strauss Foundation. And that was long before things like corporate social responsibility were around. And then he went on to serve as the executive director of the Levi Strauss Foundation. And then for the last 20 years, he helped build the Russell Family Foundation from scratch into now one of the leading foundations in the Pacific Northwest. He was the CEO of that for 20 years. He just recently retired, as you heard from him a minute ago. And one of the recent sort of awards he got, if you will, is last year Inside Philanthropy said he's the foundation president we'll miss the most. So that's kind of a unique honor, but that speaks to who Richard is an awful lot. And he told us about his personal mission statement. I'm curious, Richard, as you've gone through that 30-year career, and by the way, here's another individual that spent time in the private and in the nonprofit sector. And I think that cross-sector experience is really valuable. As you've formed your personal leadership style over the years, and I know you're a guy that's very thoughtful about it and has evolved it, was there ever a couple of role models along the way, sort of people or examples you looked to that really informed your personal style of leadership?
So that is really provocative because I thought really about who are the people that influenced me. And a lot of times in these kinds of books and these kinds of webinars, we tend to focus on that part of our life that revolves around our professional development. Mm-hmm. And your question actually forced me to look farther back in very fundamental ways. And so there's two people that come to mind when I think about who influenced my sense of leadership. And the first one came about when I graduated college in 1970. And I was without work and I was searching for my post-college life. I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area to volunteer with a community newspaper called the Peninsula Bulletin in East Palo Alto. And it was there that I helped to prepare the paper and distribute it. And I even wrote a column for the newspaper. It was one of the first Black-owned and published newspapers in the Bay Area, and it was operated by Charles Thrower, who was my uncle because he was married to my aunt, Naomi Wu Thrower. And so they both ran the paper, and they were extraordinary individuals. Charles was Black, and Naomi was Chinese American. And I was very open and close to them during this exploratory period of my life. And they really introduced me to many of the concepts of community-centered social change that I carry with me today. My Aunt Naomi was a trained teacher and social worker, and she was a member of the Human Rights Commission in Sunnyvale, California, where she still lives today, and she's now age 88 and very, very active. And so she and Charles both blended, but particularly her, she blended a deep commitment to community and justice, but she also held a deep value around human potential and self-awareness. And so I feel as though I carry that value in the kinds of leadership I try to practice nowadays.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. We sort of never know where our role models may show up from. And knowing you, Richard, that story rings very true. I'm curious. So over the years, you have been, as I said a moment ago, you're a very thoughtful guy about this. You're not rigid about your leadership approach. Over the time post-college at Levi Strauss, the last 20 years at the Russell Family Foundation, have there been big changes or sort of major inflection points in how you think about leadership and what your philosophy has been?
Well, one of the things I think I learned clearly from my time at Levi Strauss & Company and the Levi Strauss Foundation, and it transferred very well to the Russell Family Foundation, was this idea of proximity. And in the apparel business at Levi's, we always believed that the people who were closest to the customer or closest to the product, had their hands on the product itself, they had the most intelligence about the marketplace. And so it was always very important to engage them and, in fact, try to center our decision-making and work closest to the ground, closest to the product, closest to the marketplace. And I think that that's also true in the work that we did at the Russell Family Foundation, which is a belief that the foundation actually is not doing the work of social change. That in fact, what foundations do is they provide resources, they provide some convening opportunities, but the people who are really doing the work, the people who are proximate to that work, are in the communities themselves. And I think that, again, it's another reason why I say it's so important to be flexible, because whatever you imagine or dream in your boardroom and design in spreadsheets, but take out to the community in the form of philanthropic programs, they need to change and they need to respond in ways that you can't anticipate until you're actually engaged with the work of the community. And that means actually bringing the community into your own design processes. And so I think that that kind of notion about where you center your work, how much you respect you pay to those people by actually bringing them into your design thinking process and actually taking seriously their recommendations, those are all things that make you more relevant to the kinds of change you're trying to produce, the kind of pant you're trying to design, or the kinds of leadership you're attempting to uphold in your community.
That's fascinating to think that what you learned about the customer from the private sector got transferred to your social change work in the nonprofit sector. And so often in the nonprofit sector, we don't think about that person in the community as the client, right? The client's the benefactor, the client's the person with the money. So that's such a beautiful, wonderful example. I'm curious if there's anything you learned in your years at the Russell Family Foundation that maybe you wish you'd have known back at Levi Strauss. Is there anything that sort of goes back the other direction?
I'll share a story with you, and you were actually party to this at some point.
Okay.
But you may recollect that about 10 years ago, you and I had the opportunity to engage in conversations with Jamie Power.
Yes.
Of J.D. Power and Associates.
Yeah.
And the conversations that we were having back then were attempting to take one of the ideas that Jamie's family and his father, J.D. Power, really took to heart when they created J.D. Power and Associates and the whole field of customer satisfaction. And I remember listening to the stories that Jamie told about what prompted his father to do that, because he worked in the automobile industry. And in the period of time when they came up with the customer satisfaction paradigm, the industry was largely built around this notion of the car manufacturer and the car dealer, and that everything that was measured were between those two poles.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in fact, I remember Jamie saying that what was very powerful to his father was in the 1960s when John F. Kennedy proclaimed the Consumer Bill of Rights, the idea that there was a Bill of Rights and a responsibility that producers had in the industrial age, that prompted his father to think about not just the relationship between the car manufacturer and the car dealer, but the end user, who is the person who buys and drives that car. And in effect, J.D. Power and Associates, they broadened that model and they went all the way to the end user and really began to mine that field for what is the ultimate service that we're providing? What's the ultimate quality that's being delivered? What is the customer or the beneficiary asking us to deliver? And I think it dramatically, of course, changed the field. And one of the things I think it's important in philanthropy, and especially now in the time that we're in, is to not think of the relationship but just between the funder and the service provider, but who are the beneficiaries?
Mm-hmm.
And how is the funding and the convening and the policy making that you're developing actually going to reflect their interests? Because there can be a difference between what's needed on the part of beneficiaries and how organizations represent those needs and how funders respond. And so that's one thing I think that in the last 10 years, it happened to be a relationship that was driven in part by business, J.D. Power, but also trying to apply that model to philanthropy and come up with an equivalent kind of paradigm. I believe that would have been very helpful to us 30 years ago at Levi Strauss & Company. And I think that it ultimately was embedded in part in the DNA of that company anyway. So I think things are continuing to evolve.
Absolutely. Richard's one of these guys that you could just peel back the layer in so many different directions. So when I talked to you about 6 months or so ago about the book that I wrote and that I'm going to be fortunate enough to publish in March, there were two things you talked to me about in the book that really stood out to me. One of those was about the importance of mindfulness as a leader. And you've touched on it just a little bit in some of your earlier remarks. I'd love to have you take us just a little bit more into what does mindfulness mean as a leader and how does that impact how you show up as a leader?
Sure. Let me go back a moment and say that one of the things that I think is fundamentally critical in leadership is relational leadership and the quality of relationships. I do believe that there is such a thing as personal chemistry. And I think that we as individuals have a tool that is able to contribute to that chemistry, and it's ourselves. And it's knowledge that we hold and our ability to bring that to the table and stir that into the mix. And so when I say that, I try to approach all of my relationships professionally and personally with the idea of being present to what's happening in the moment. And especially in a professional setting where so often the paradigms are around strategy and the paradigms are around prediction and the paradigms are about beating the future by getting there ahead of other people. I think those kinds of qualities actually run counter to the notion of mindfulness. And so when I'm engaged in a coaching conversation with a colleague, or if I'm facilitating a group of people around a very complex or personally challenging discussion, like how to engage and make real change around racial justice in the era of COVID, what I try to do is really slow down. And even with the limitations of Zoom, to try to concentrate on what's being said at the moment and whose eyes I'm able to see at that moment. And what that begins to do, as people who have done any kind of reflective practice, a lot of the challenge is about clearing away the distractions. And sometimes in meditation, it's about breathing. And other times it's about concentrating and keeping eye contact. And so in a literal way, when I'm in a potentially tense or conflicted moment, I will take a deep breath and I will slow down and I will try to pay attention to what's being said and stay in that moment. And I'll try to let go of a lot of the pressures that might be in the back of my mind, like what's going to be said next? How can we get to our strategic plan? Am I going to have the right answer for this question? And if I do, will people see that I'm of value and be willing to pay me my consulting fees? I mean, those are all the kinds of little and big ideas that get in the way of these relations. And I think that when you're actually in conversation or in the presence of someone who's being completely present with you, you can feel that, and it frees you up to be more of who you are. And if you are, in fact, someone who has responsibility for leadership, then that's what we need to plug into, because that's what the organization is calling for. And that's what your colleagues are asking of you.
And empowering that and the people that work with and around you, that is our job as a leader, to do exactly that.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I realized, and I expected this to be the case when I retired, because I retired as planned on January 2020. And then less than 2 months later, in March, unexpectedly, the whole world retired with me.
That's a good way to put it. Well, I can attest that I've seen you more than once in meetings with you where you will just pause for a moment. And the first time you did that, I can remember thinking, what's this guy doing? And then after I got to know you a little bit longer, when I saw you take those little momentary pauses, I knew exactly what you were doing. And it's a very powerful thing. It's a very simple thing that I think is very powerful for leaders to think of. There was one other concept you talked to me about when we were having a conversation about the book I was writing. The phrase really stuck with me, and it feels really relevant, but I want you to amplify that for me. And you said there's the notion of organizationless leaders. So I'm just interested where that phrase came to you from, and what do you think the implications are of that for sort of how leadership will play out in the future?
Sure. That came to me early in the pandemic as a country and a world were locking down. And as we necessarily were looking to others and for institutional leadership as to how we might respond to this public health threat and the implications of the economics and personal safety. And I looked around me and I felt that there were major institutions and organizations that we were dependent upon that appeared to be leaderless. And I won't go into the specifics of that, but I think that in that moment, 10, 12 months ago, we needed a kind of leadership to step forward and to do the kind of focusing and reaffirming and methodical stepping forward to get us safely to the future. And I felt that that was being lost as an opportunity. So I actually realized that in my retirement, there was this notion of there being organizations that are without leaders, and it's possible for there to be people who are leading without organizations. And so that's how that two-sided concept came together.
Yep.
And, out of self-interest, it came to me because I realized I was retiring and entering a world without an organization and without all the trappings of that organization. But I felt as though I didn't necessarily need that to define who I was or to determine what I could do to make a contribution. And I think that what we have seen in the past year, and we've known this long before that institutions can take on a life of their own, and that in many cases, what needs to happen is people need to be able to exist with the light footprint of an organization and a set of boundaries and responsibilities, but also be very able to take risks and be entrepreneurial and to work independently within that footprint, because that's where the innovation comes. And in fact, as we think about organization-less leaders, I think that as the workplace changes, we still don't know whether workplaces predominantly are going to be place-based or remote in the future. We don't know exactly how business models will be around brick and mortar or digital. Well, we do know it's going to largely go digital, and it's going to keep going that way. I think more and more the definitions of what an organization is and who's a leader in an organization is going to continue to evolve.
Yep.
And so for organizations, whether they're for-profit or nonprofit, it's really incumbent on people with leadership responsibilities to engage our colleagues in embracing that flexibility. That means that they can hold something lightly, but we be willing to let it go, because it's going to be the evolution that is constant, not the rigidity of your anchors that will hold you in place.
Yep. I think when you use the term organizationless, when I reflected on that, I feel like you gave a name to something that was sort of emergent and happening more. But because of the last 9 months, the slope of the curve just inflected, and it really has accelerated the notion of organizationless leaders. So that's a concept and a thought I'm going to carry with me for certain. Just a couple last questions for you, Richard. One is, I always like to ask folks, if you could, especially someone like you with such a depth and a richness of experience, if you sort of had one or two pieces of leadership advice for either a 20-something emerging leader or that version of yourself back in the 70s in the Bay Area, what are the one or two pieces of leadership advice that you give to someone?
I would say that one is that fear is just an emotion, and it can come and it can just as easily go and pass. And that in the face of fear, hope is something that can have lasting impact, and it's much more life-giving and leads to much better outcomes if you're able to hold on to hope.
That's great. So that's going to lead me to my last question. I have a hunch of where you're going to answer this, but I'm not totally sure. When you sort of look at the world, in particular the leaders around us today, do you feel more hopeful or do you feel more fearful about the next, 10 years ahead of us? Or are you maybe not sure and just time will tell?
Well, again, getting back to the notion of mindfulness, I'm trying to avoid predicting what the next 10 years will hold, because I think those next 10 years will be the cumulative effect of what we do moment to moment. And by the same token, as I look back on my life, I realize that when I was younger, I used to believe that change could happen in a matter of years. And I had the kind of exuberance and naivete that comes with that, and which you need oftentimes to tilt against windmills. But I then realized that it really isn't just a matter of years, that it's in fact oftentimes decades that it takes change to happen. And as we've seen now revealed in 2020, with the kind of deep-rooted inequities in our society and in the world that it is a matter of lifetimes to deconstruct and rebuild those systems. And I say that with a sense of hope. I don't say that with fear, because I am very hopeful about what this moment is in the world. I think that we have turned a corner and there's no going back. That some people may believe that they have discovered something for the first time, but none of this is new. It's been known by many people who've lived on the margins throughout our lives and throughout the legacies of our families before us. But for some people, it is new. And I'm hoping that, in fact, the combination of those kinds of forces between people who have worked for justice for many years and people who wish to be allies in that process can take this moment and move it forward, because there is no hope in going back. That is really gone. And I believe that what is important is persevering, celebrating our victories, and never giving up. So that's my hope for the future.
Well, and I need, and the world needs, leaders like you to feel hopeful, for sure. So that's a beautiful answer about hope versus fear. I'm curious, too, that kind of goes along with that. Are there any things that you've learned specifically in this year 2020 that you would offer to a new leader or an emerging leader that you'd hope they'd take away from this year that would inform their leadership going forward?
I had a conversation yesterday with a group of people who are planning a conference in 2021 for the nonprofit community. And the theme of their conference is on place, space, and time, and how all of those have been disrupted in the course of the pandemic and everything that's happened. And as someone who's worked in a place-based foundation like the Russell Family Foundation, and even the Levi Strauss Foundation, which was based in communities where we made our products over the years, I have a deep respect for what happens in a particular place. And I think that notion of place and the people who are in that place is something that is not going to dissipate. It's not going to change. It's not going to move away in the era of the pandemic. In fact, it needs to be made stronger. Even as digital worlds seem to pull us further apart, when we talk about building back better, when we talk about bridging the divide, we're not talking about technologies. We're talking about the people who now find themselves so far apart that it's hard to imagine being in community. So I believe that in 2021, certainly, and in the next years that form the next decade, it's going to be critical for us to be able to make every moment a moment where we're in relationship with each other, where we are curious about one another, we're willing to look at our own beliefs and consider those of another person. Because I believe that when we get in those spaces, we will find that we can actually commit to building a better place, a more accepting space, and something that is timeless for our communities going forward, because time is very precious. I'm seeing this in my own personal life, and I know people are seeing this in the pandemic, and even probably more so than ever. We're realizing that the planet is facing the consequences of climate change. And if there's one thing the pandemic has done, it has shown us what happens when the world takes a break from everything that has been warming the planet. So it is possible. It may not exist in the same kind of economic system that we've always held our beliefs in, but we may not be able to hold those systems together as the planet leaves us behind.
Thank you so much, Richard. You and I probably had a conversation like this, I don't know, a dozen times, probably over the last 20 years, you know. It's always good. I always feel enriched, and I always learn more than one thing new from you each time we talk. So thank you a whole ton for your time, sir.
All right. Thank you. And I appreciated reading about some of the other amazing people in the book, and I feel privileged to be counted among them.
Thank you. Have a good holiday. I'll talk to you in 2021.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Rebuilders Podcast. For more information, resources, and episodes, visit paulshoemaker.org. That's paulshoemaker.org.